everybody. It's Larry Kotlikoff. Welcome back to Economics Matters, the podcast. I'm delighted to have my good friend, young economist Robby Akerlof, with us. Robby is a professor, an associate professor of economics at the University of Warwick in England, and a research affiliate of the Center for Economic Policy Research, which is called CEPR, SCEPR. It's a famous, it's the counterpart of the NBR in the US. Prior to joining Warwick University, Robby was a postdoc at MIT's Sloan School of Management. He received his PhD from Harvard, where he was a presidential scholar. Now, Robby, I haven't had too many younger economists on the podcast. I figured I would work through the older ones that I know close, first. But Robby is the first younger guy I've had on because his work is so interesting. It deals with the interface between sociology and economics, organizational economics, and applied microeconomic theory, and social interaction. So he's really basically well, not the first economist who has kind of connected economics and sociology. I think his dad, George Akerlof, has done a lot in that area, and other economists have as well. But I think Robby's taking this to a kind of different level. And I want to start out by saying hi, Robby, and good to have you. Thanks for joining.
Thank you, Larry. Thanks for having me on. It's a pleasure to be with you.
Great. And I thought what we would do is, talk a bit about your papers. Your vita, the papers you've published have some very interesting titles, like Stories at Work. And then we've got another paper called Value Formation and the Role of Esteem. And then there's another paper here, Anger and Enforcement. These are not typical titles of economics articles. And, getting economists engaged in the interface between economics and sociology, getting economists to get out of their own kind of way and think beyond their nose about the world in a entirely different way outside of their narrow models, mathematical models, is not easy. And you've had an uphill battle, I think, but you've succeeded because you're, tenured professor at Warwick. You have some great articles here, been published in leading journals. But give everybody, a little bit of an intro. Let's start out with this paper called Stories at Work. Tell us about Stories at Work, and then I'm going to do some other, tell us about the other papers a bit, and then we'll kind of think about this, the whole genre of work here and how it connects to some bigger social and policy questions. So fire away.
Very good. Okay, so let me just start by giving a sense of what this kind of research agenda is about. So I think traditionally economics has viewed people as individualistic in the sense that people have fixed preferences, and that's that. And so our job then is to try and satisfy those preferences. So this research takes seriously the idea that who we are, what our preferences are, is very much shaped by our surroundings, and in particular by our social interactions. So I think that's one distinguishing feature. And then I think the other one is that people have moralities. So I think we normally model people as just having things that they want. And this is viewing people as not only having things they want, but views about what is good and bad and right and wrong. And those may be good views of what's right and wrong, or they might be very bad ones. But those are things that motivate people in important ways. And might, for instance, lead to anger and punishment and conflict and things like that. So this paper on Stories at Work is about trying to apply that to thinking about firms and other organizations. And so it's taking the point of view that that people are very much guided by stories, and these stories could be just a belief system that people have. So there's some work, for instance, by Roland Benabou and co-authors about belief in a just world. So you could, have a story that conveys something like, do you think that people who work hard get rewarded for that, or maybe you do, maybe you don't. So that would be an example of one kind of a story. So these stories can also have some moral content about who you see as a good person and who you see as a bad person. So so in this article, we look at a variety of different types of stories that organizations can have, and the role that they can play in motivating workers.
So there's stories that organizations are telling their workers, right?
Exactly. So let me just give one very simple example of the way in which people can be changed by stories. So so this comes from Robert Frank and co-authors, and so he shows that.
Cornell, just so everybody knows. Yeah.
Good.
Right.
Good. So they show that if you look at undergraduate students at Cornell, that taking economics classes affects the way they play a prisoner's dilemma game. So should I describe a prisoner's dilemma game? So prisoner's dilemma game is one where people have a choice between being cooperative or defecting. So it's always in your individual interest to be a defector, but if everyone's cooperative, that everyone does better. And so what Frank finds is that if you haven't taken an economics class, people are pretty cooperative. And so a way to think about that is they have that sense of that's their ethic. That's their sense of what's good and bad. They think that, it's good to be cooperative, and that, that should trump their personal interests. After people start taking economics classes, you see a big reduction in the rate of cooperation. And so my way of thinking about that is, not that people are lacking any morality, but it's changing what they see that morality as being. And so, you're now labeled as an irrational person if you are a cooperator. Why wouldn't you? Economics teaches people that you're supposed to, if you're rational, you act in your self-interest. And so a good rational person will be a defector. And so it conveys a certain type of morality. So that's a type of morality that one can see in firms. One can see people acting in a self-interested way like that in firms. But you can also see other moralities where it's your duty to be cooperative with your fellow workers. There's a sense of collective identity that's created, and so so these different moralities can serve different purposes. So you can make people very competitive with each other by making them individualistic. And sometimes that can work to the advantage of getting workers to work hard, and so it could serve the interests of a firm. But on the other hand, it could really go against the interests of the firm if you want to get people to cooperate. So one example of that in a firm is Microsoft. So when Steve Ballmer became CEO of Microsoft, he put in a system called rank and yank that was very popular at the time with firms, and is still a common practice of many firms. And so what the way this rank and yank system works is that workers are typically put into three tiers. They're put into a top tier of stars, a middle tier, and then like a bottom 10% of low performers. And so if you're in the star category, you get something like a bonus or a promotion. And if you're in the bottom 10%, you're typically fired.
You're yanked.
You're yanked. You're one of the yanked people. Exactly. And so, so Microsoft, in some sense, in putting this system in place, they're conveying this kind of individualistic story that the economics classes convey. And so they were telling people that, you're out for yourself. You're not out to protect your fellow workers and keep them from being yanked. It wasn't a sense of some collective endeavor. And in fact, even worse, what happened is that people would then suck up to their managers to try and get a good rating. So people would look at their colleagues and they say, you got a good ranking, not because you were a good worker, but because you sucked up. So everyone got to be very angry with one another. They're individualistics and they're competitive, but they lost that sense of working together. And, it's been suggested that this caused a kind of lost decade for Microsoft, where a lot of their innovations didn't get followed through.
Have they reverted back to the old style? Have they got rid of?
I think things have changed now. I'm not sure exactly what things look like now, but I think they've gotten rid of this rank and yank. That's what I think.
So how much of this is people's morality changing versus, think about the kids who take economics versus their perception of the world in which they're exercising their morality. People might, if I'm in a world where I think nobody's being cooperative and I take the economics course, before I took the economics course, I thought everybody was cooperative and that I'm dealing with. So if I play this game with other people, they're likely to be cooperative. And even if it's irrational for both of us to be, for either of us to act in a cooperative manner, we both act, I think they're going to act irrationally. So therefore I act irrationally. Therefore we both end up doing better than had we acted in a brutish manner, just in purely self-interest. So how much of it do you think is was that exposure to economics changing people's morality or perception of what they should be, how they should be behaving, or a change in their perception of who's out there that they're interacting with?
Okay, so very, very good question. So I think it's very situational how people behave. So I wouldn't look at this as necessarily universally making, you take an economics class, you're universally made into a selfish person. I think it may just be that there's a context where you're made into a selfish person. And I think, you could think of markets as exactly a context where people have the view that's a place you're allowed to act for yourself. So you don't have to, if you're a buyer, you don't have to think so much about the seller and making sure the seller, you want to get a good deal versus the seller, and vice versa. And that's okay. There's certain rules that you're supposed to follow in a market of not cheating and so forth. But within certain bounds, you're allowed to act somewhat self-interestedly. But then you move someone into a different context, like a family context, and people know that's not a market, and you're not allowed to behave that way anymore. So I think these things are very situational, and it's partly, so I think there are two elements of this. So one element that you're getting at is who are you paired with, and who do you think they are in terms of their ethic or their personality. And I think another is just the situation. So it might be that, the same people, you move into market context, and they're going to act selfishly toward each other. And then you move them out of the market context, and they're going to treat each other with real care and concern. So I think that's one element. I think then this other element that you're getting at is very much there too, which is that, I might be prepared to act cooperatively, but I think the other person I face is going to be selfish. And why should I be cooperative when the other person is going to be selfish?
Right. So this morality, let's say, this instinct be to be cooperative, and there's another instinct here to be selfish that you can kind of turn on and off depending on the setting. Where do you think this is coming from? Do you think this is somehow genetic evolution? We know this famous book called The Selfish Gene, that every gene's out for itself, and I don't know where the state of evolutionary theory is, whether the current view is that all evolution is kind of intrinsically selfish, or whether species evolve because they have genes that are where the different agents in the species are cooperating, sacrificing themselves, for example, to save the queen bee. And I mean, do you connect this to, or you just take this as given? Do you connect this back to anything kind of more fundamental in human evolution?
So, I mean, I think a way of thinking about this is that these norms are kind of software that we have. So they can be programmed to make us more selfish, less selfish. And it's more than just whether we cooperate or we don't. I mean, they're subtle. These norms are very subtle in terms of what they can program us to do. We can talk more about some of the things they program us to do. But in a sense, they're a software we've been given. I think, and then of course, it's on a hardware platform that our genes have given us. So I think, my view would be that, we've evolved to have this kind of software that's extremely useful and allows us then to be very adaptable to all kinds of situations. And one of the things that it allows us, of course, to do is to cooperate. So I think, a lot of the evolutionary literature has suggested that, these norms are in the service of cooperation. But I think, it's important to note that they are very adaptable. They can change very quickly. And they are not always things that work in our service towards some purpose of fitness. So they can do things like cause, us to get into horrendous conflicts with each other, and and do things that burn through huge amounts of surplus. So so one thing I think these norms get us to do, for instance, and this could be functional or not, is that when other people violate norms, we get angry. We want to punish them. So we're willing to expend resources to punish others, and that can be very functional because it can mean that we have good mechanisms in place to enforce norms. And, that can do things like enforce cooperation. But it can also mean, particularly if you and I have different views about what's right and wrong, we could have a terrible, terrible fight with each other. So we're seeing lots of such fights, of course, around the world. So I just don't want to give the impression these things always end up being functional.
But if we're getting into a fight where neither of us has anything to gain from, or if we both, jointly stop the fight, or even if one of us stops the fight and the other continues, that's better for us, but we keep at it. Where does, is that just irrational? Would you view that as, that our software is screwed up and cannot, got somehow stuck in some bug in our brain and we can't get out from under?
So I think in terms of how to model conflict, I think it's possible to model some of this conflict as at least relatively rational, in the sense that you may not, as an individual, be able to get out of having. Let's take some particular norms. So maybe, for instance, there is a plot of land that two people are fighting over. So these norms might say, your norm might be it's your plot, my norm might be it's my plot. And then so I guess the question is, what's irrational here? I mean, if you try and take the plot, I'm going to get angry, and then I might engage in some punishment. And if I punish you, you might be angry because of your norms and punish back, and we might have then a conflict. Now, in some sense, it's rational. I mean, assuming that those norms I have are something I'm stuck with, and it's not something I can easily get out of. So
might be able to by fighting back, even if you don't win, you might suggest to raise the price to the other side about taking more of the land, let's say, right?
Well, I'm thinking of it as rational in the sense that you're motivated to punish the other party, and that is itself becomes an objective once you have certain norms. That's the sense in which I'm viewing it as rational. And you may not be, perhaps if you could get out of that psychology and change your norms, or forgive the other party and get rid of your anger, that might be to your benefit, but that may not be an individual choice.
Right. I guess I'm trying to get at whether we're programmed to be crazy, to get like angry, so angry that we can't even think anymore. And now it's that, having software that puts us in that state under certain circumstances might be somehow rational from the perspective of the species for its survival, but individually it could be pretty nuts, right?
So I think we're on the same page in the sense that I guess I'm trying to distinguish two versions of rationality. So, one is, are you acting toward an economic end? And the other is, are you acting towards some end, maybe not economic, but revenge can be its own end. So I think people may not even be rational in the sense of the revenge end, because you can get hot in some way that makes you irrational even toward that end. But I think as I think you're getting at, people can work in ways that are very non-economic. But as you say, potentially to the benefit of your group, or potentially it serves as a credible threat.
Or it could also be, maybe there's a switch in your software that goes on that says, I actually enjoy fighting. That this somehow, is entertainment for me at some level. And maybe that, we should move on to some of your other papers, which I think connect to those, some of those questions. But well, let's talk about the role of esteem. We've got this paper called Value Formation, the role of esteem. Tell everybody about that one.
Good. Yeah, we can come back to this because I have some other work that speaks to this topic of anger. But yeah, so let me tell you about this work about esteem. So, okay, so I think maybe it's good to think about a high school as a kind of setting where this can come up, but it could apply to many settings. But think about your typical American high school. So the typical American high school has these different sorts of groups in it. So you have the jocks, and you have the nerds, and in the education literature, it's not a very polite term, but they often refer to kids who are kind of maybe more outsiders to the school as burnouts. So those are people who, I don't know, maybe they dye their hair a funny color or something like that. And they tend not, those are kids who tend not to like school and tend to have a kind of oppositional direction toward the school itself. But you can think of these different sorts of groups, and particularly, jocks will tend to hang out with other jocks. Nerds will tend to hang out with other nerds. So this is what sociologists refer to as value homophily. So the idea being that, so each of these groups, you can think about, let's just take the jocks. So they have certain values. And so what are these values? So they value athletic achievement. And those values mean they affect the way that the jocks esteem everybody in the school, themselves and others. So they can say, we're the athletic stars of the school, and because we value athletics, that means we're doing the right thing and we're esteem worthy. And whereas the nerds and the burnouts, they look down on those folks because they're presumably puny wimps who don't do well at athletics. So So it affects their whole way of according esteem, these values. Similarly, then the nerds have their own value system that presumably place more weight on academic achievement. So if you look at these two groups, the jocks and the nerds, each is going to think of themselves as superior to the other group. So this paper is trying to understand what's going on in a high school like this, and taking a step back, these values have they have a lot of consequences in terms of how people are behaving in the school. So being a jock rather than a nerd is going to really affect where you put your effort in school. So presumably creating a good culture within a school that has the right types of values. And by the way, some jocks, of course, also value academics, so it can be more complicated. But anyway, having the right types of values in a school matters in terms of how the students do. But here's what this paper tries to do then. So it tries to model what the motivations are for students in a school like this, and then think about how you can get a culture like this forming where you have different groups with different values. And so here are the basic elements that are going on. So the basic elements that are going on are that people get to choose their values. So you could choose to value athletics, you could choose to value academics, you could choose to value something else as burnouts may. And then these values affect how you esteem people relative to each other. Okay, so I've already kind of given you that piece of it. Then the next piece of it is that people care about self-esteem. So your values affect how you esteem yourself as well as everybody else. So you care about how you feel you should be esteemed on the basis of these values you've internalized. But you also then care about how others esteem you in the school, and you particularly care about how others esteem you in the school if you interact with them a lot. And so there's both this concern about self-esteem, but also peer esteem. And these then are the two key forces that lead to the patterns in a school like this. And so if you think about what peer esteem and that concern does, so think about, suppose you're put in with this group of athletes. So what you're gonna see is all these other athletes, they value athletics, and unless you do athletics, they're gonna look down on you. And so there's a strong incentive in that environment to put effort into athletics. So let's say you do that and you're putting effort into athletics, then maybe you're going to be sufficiently good at it that it also is good from a self-esteem point of view to value athletics, because there's some nerds in the school that now you can look down on. And so the implication then is interacting with the jocks may turn you into a jock. So the peer esteem is sort of leading to a conformity effect. So that's the idea. So it's leading people to engage in conformity. If we think, on the other hand, about self-esteem, that can lead to differentiation. So imagine you see there are these group of jocks, and imagine you don't have to interact with the jocks. You might find that you can have higher self-esteem by focusing on something else, like academics. And if you then value academics and focus on academics, you can then look down in turn on the jocks, and that gives you higher self-esteem. So these two forces that are leading, on the one hand, so the peer esteem is leading to conformity, the self-esteem is leading to differentiation, and one can think about an equilibrium in this environment and the equilibrium is one that balances these two forces. And it tends to lead then to the formation of groups that have similar values within the school, but you also tend to see multiple groups form because of these self-esteem concerns. I'll stop there. I'd say, yeah.
Okay, so does this mean that a school could, I get my comparative advantage in athletics is pretty good. I'm going to and I got, basically can hang out with, I need friends, and I guess there's the issue of why, fundamentally why we care about esteem, and that may be going beyond even sociology, to genetics and to, needing to be in a tribe or whatever for protection. Anyway, so here I am thinking, well, I could join this group and spend more time studying, or this group and spend more time in the basketball court practicing. And I choose, because I have a comparative advantage in doing the basketball, I go over to the basketball court. But some sense I give up too much of my lifetime earnings by doing that, because the chances of my getting into the NBA are zilch. Maybe I'll get a better chance of whatever, different kind of a social life here versus there. But the question is, would schools then have an ability to change this culture in a way that it sounds like you can have a lot of people making the wrong moves here.
Yeah.
And that they're spending too much, they should be studying when they're practicing, and they should be practicing when they're studying. And that, is that something with, does this have practical implications for how, if you're talking to a high school principal, we say, here's what you need to do to change this up and get people out of there. I mean, maybe just talking to the kids about it, about, these stereotypes. I guess that's an old sociological term. Are you this or that, or are you are you really anything you want to be? And let's try and get yourself out of your own way. Open up your horizons. Is that something that you see as a practical application of this?
Yeah, so I think there are a number of paths for kind of intervening in changing a culture. And there's no exact recipe, because it does. I think one of the things this type of economics does is it says you really do need to know the particularities of a situation to know what the best thing to do is. But I think there's a broad set of categories of things that we can think about as intervention. So one is you can think about what is, and you were getting at this initially, what are your underlying economic incentives? So that, I mean, that's something that's there too. So there may be some limit to how much you go off and do athletics if there are economic costs. So that is there. But it only works up to a point. So I think other things one can do is that one can intervene in terms of the social interactions themselves. So so you can try and prevent. I mean, so imagine, for instance, you have somebody who's a class clown. I mean, that can be really an infectious thing. And so that's what this model would suggest, that those values start to propagate. So I think one has to think about trying to put people together in the right ways. There's a problem that it's complicated, because you can have both beneficial peer effects happening here, but you can also have some very negative peer effects happening here. So for instance, if you get rid of the class clown from this class, maybe you put a bunch of class clowns together and they all have bad effects on one another. So one wants to balance, the sort of the good and the bad of moving people around. There's no, I think, easy way to do that. I guess
the most important application here is probably with respect to gangs inside high schools, right?
Exactly. So there's a good book which I talk about in this paper. So it's about something that's basically a gang inside a high school, and so this book is called "Learning to Labor" by a sociologist named Paul Willis, and so he did a study of a school in the Midlands in the UK. I think probably in Birmingham, although he doesn't specify. And this school has a group of boys called the Lads. and they're the cut-ups in the school. So they're constantly causing trouble for the teachers, and they get themselves suspended in the final week of school by cutting up. They're getting a kind of laugh out of each of them is sort of getting a kind of laugh from making the teacher annoyed and doing difficult things. And then they really look down on the other students. They call those students the ear rolls. So because they call them the ear rolls as in ear holes, because they just sort of suck up what the teacher tells them, which they think's not great. And so I think the problem that these kids have is that their view is that, so they have these teachers who come from a very different background. So they're not sort of working class Birmingham folks. And they really kind of look down on that whole culture, and the culture of the lads, and the culture of the lads' parents and families. And the lads' families, they understand to an extent why they're acting up. And so there's this sort of basic value clash that to some extent might be preventable. So I think, trying to find a way where the lads aren't in a kind of difficult position of either kind of disrespecting their backgrounds and their families or disrespecting the teachers. They have this kind of difficult choice to make. And maybe, yeah.
Is there any solution that comes out in the book? I mean, does anybody have a clever way of resolving the problem?
I don't think they have a perfect solution in the book, but I think, I think that a message of the book is that one has to find a way of respecting the students' backgrounds and where they're from, and that requires some work on the part of the teachers and the school and the way it presents itself.
I see. Okay.
Um,
Let's talk about another one of your papers, which is called Anger and Enforcement. This goes back to we were discussing this, but maybe you want to expand on that particular paper.
Yeah, and we can think about it with respect to the lads, in fact. So the idea of this paper, so this comes to this question of the enforcement of norms, but also these sort of perverse things that can happen where you can have a feud, you can have a fight. So here's the basic concept of this paper. So the basic concept of this paper, it's an idea about what exactly it is in our psychology that makes us angry. And so the idea is this, and so it relates to a concept in the law. So in the law, there's something called the reasonable person test. And so what the reasonable person test in the law says is that one comes up with some definition of what a reasonable person is. And that's some notion of how somebody should be properly motivated. And in particular, motivated in the sense of what is their view of what is right and what is wrong. So for instance, the initial case that established this idea of the reasonable person test was about a tugboat accident, and there was sort of a driver who wasn't paying proper attention and so forth, and so the question was, well, how much should the driver have, as a reasonable person, been careful, and whatever. There's presumably everyone has some limits to how much you can be careful. Could this accident have occurred with a careful driver who is appropriately careful, or did it necessarily happen with a driver who, didn't put proper weight on being a careful driver? So one can think about that more generally. So each person can have their own standard of reasonableness, and it's based on your view of what you think is right and wrong and good and bad. So you have your own norms that you apply to yourself and to others that establish what a reasonable person is. And then you see, compared to a reasonable person, was some harm inflicted. So if we think about the school context with the lads and their teachers they don't like, so the lads think that the teachers are harming them relative to what a reasonable teacher would do. And there are various ways in which they feel harmed. Probably the most important way in which they feel harmed is just the disrespect they suffer. So they feel that they're owed a relatively high degree of respect, and the teachers don't give them that level of respect. So that basic value clash, so values are a type of norm, that leads immediately to anger. And so that's, I think, a key reason why the lads are acting up is, they feel if they don't, that they're sitting on these grievances. And they just can't live with not showing that they think some injustice has taken place, some unfairness has taken place. And this is something, yeah.
So this is culture clash, and are we kind of somehow destined as humanity destined to always have people of this culture, people of this culture, and they get together and they can't live with each other. They have to immediately react. My culture is better than yours. Mine's better than, is that, or do we see examples where this somehow gets resolved, or maybe just, full sessions where people talk about their different backgrounds? Do we have, any evidence that people can become open-minded as more than a couple people, but large groups can change their behavior or way to think about things? I've always, yeah.
Yeah, so I think that's a perfect question. So I think my view is that, okay, so one way to try and mediate these kinds of conflicts is to try and create some commonality of culture. Of course, that's one thing you can do, is try and get people on the same page. But of course, people are never going to be fully on the same page. So there are always going to be some antagonisms that exist. And so I think part of trying to eliminate these conflicts is also trying to have a set of judicial processes that are at work as well. And so, so one place this fits in, there's a literature on culture of honor versus culture of law. And so culture of honor is something where, I'm really, if someone has done something to me, so the lad's honor is insulted, they're supposed to stick up for themselves and defend themselves. That's a slight to their honor. They're supposed to do something about it. And, presumably there's also some notion of masculinity involved. You're less of a man if you don't defend your honor and things like that. But, culture of law is trying to take these processes of out of the hands of the individuals who feel slighted. So, if I feel some wrong has been done, there's a further norm in place within a society that I'm not supposed to act out myself. I'm supposed to take this to the proper authority. And then those authorities will engage in some kind of adjudicatory process. And so having additional norms that presumably everyone then has to subscribe to up to a point, that say, it's not up to you to decide the punishments for people. You have to take this to a legal process. And then there are further questions we could get into about how do those legal processes maintain their legitimacy, which would mean that these norms that people go to the courts and legal processes, those continue to hold sway and so forth. But yeah, we can talk about that if you want.
Okay. Well, let's see how we can, we've got a list of kind of general areas where this take on economics has some kind of something to say. So schooling, we talked about family, gender, crisis. I just want to go through a list here. Schooling,
Good.
family, gender, crisis of masculinity,
Hmm.
incentives and organizations, judicial systems and conflicts. We talked a little bit about that just now.
Hmm.
Political systems, as in the rise of Trump. So let's talk about the gender, family, crisis of masculinity. First of all, what is the crisis of masculinity at this point?
Very good. Okay. So I think, this, this relates to our discussion here about people feeling that they're not getting the esteem that they feel is due to them, or not getting a high level of esteem in society. So I think the way I think about this problem of crisis of masculinity, so if we look at the prime male labor force participation rate in the United States, so it's really plummeted. So I think it's now somewhere in the mid 80s, something like 87%. I don't have the exact number, but it's really fallen. So it used to be in the high 90s, and it's fallen to the mid 80s. So you have all these prime age men who are not working, and a lot of these men now also don't have family. So you've seen a real change in family structure. We can get more into exactly what it looks like, but a kind of disintegration of the kind of sort of stable nuclear families that one might have seen a generation ago. And so these men are kind of rootless, jobless, without clear family to guide them, and they feel, I think, that they're not in a place where they're getting to go back to the concept of peer esteem. They're lacking for peer esteem, either coming from family or coming from their job. So they're lacking for community that gives them a sense of esteem and identity. And I think that's then affecting our politics in lots of ways. So this is a kind of base, for instance, for Donald Trump.
So how is this different between males and females? Why is it, the female labor force participation is going up, right? At the same time, the male
Yes.
participation has gone down. We don't see males becoming homemakers in large numbers. So I presume they're doing something in the underground economy. This might be legal, illegal, or they're working part-time. And so when you come and ask them if they're participating, a lot of the time they're not participating. But why does this cut differently for males versus females, do you think? And
So I think,
in general, do they
yeah.
have different kind of, do they have their own kind of esteem groups that are very different from the male? I mean, the jocks, there are some female jocks clearly, but it's not historically hasn't been as big a deal as male jocks, right? In schools, females aren't in gangs to the extent that males are. So the genetics must be playing a big role here.
So I think I maybe I can take a step back before answering that specific question. It's a great question, and think. So I think so let me maybe start a little bit with how I'm thinking about the family, and maybe thinking about it differently from say a Bakerian view of the family. And I think maybe then it'll come back to your question, if that's okay. Okay, so I think if one thinks about what the Bakerian view of the family is, it's thinking about things in very transactional terms. So so we have our sort of rational individuals who play the prisoner's dilemma game as a defect strategy. That's sort of the Becker type of member of the family. And then within that family,
anybody doesn't know this. Robby's referring to Gary Becker, the famous Nobel laureate at the University of Chicago, now deceased, who kind of started the field of human capital and also studied the family, the different tried to put an economic angle or lens on every behavior, whether it's divorce, marriage, having kids, and giving treating people within the family, bequests, all those kinds of decisions. Everything was strictly economics to Becker. But take it away, Robby.
Great, thanks. So in the Becker view of the family is a little bit like a factory. So it's a little factory, and it makes sense in his telling to have a division of labor within that factory, where some members of the family engage in what he calls household production. So that's what his view is to wives do in the family, and then the men will go out and engage in production outside of the family. So this for him gives us some notion of a separation of labor, and he's got a story as to why they're different roles for men and women. Of course, he doesn't quite explain why it's always men who go outside and women stay inside. But at any rate, it tells the story for this division of labor. So I think there are a bunch of things that sort of view of the family doesn't account for. This very transactional view of the family. And so for instance, if you just think about this division of labor, if you look at different types of families, they really vary in terms of what the division of labor looks like. So if you look at families so I have a paper where we look at, we show there kind of a variety of practices of families that go together as a bundle. And so we call one bundle traditional and one bundle modern. And this more modern type of family, you don't see much division of labor at all. This traditional type, though, you do. So he doesn't explain why this should differ across different types of families. I mean, that's sort of one indication there's something missing from his story there. So what we argue in this paper is that there's a story that a family has. There may be multiple stories a family has, but there are stories that families have that affect what their key objectives are, and so if you don't understand what the story of a family is, you're not really going to understand what their maximization problem is, and they're going to make just very different choices depending on what this story is. So we tell the story.
They are their own esteem group. They form their own esteem group, and you need to know what esteem is they're producing for each other. Let's say the spouses or whatever.
Exactly. So, I mean, the family may be embedded in a community that shares this story as well, but even just within the family, they're producing for each other to maximize some joint value, some joint goal. So what we argue is that these modern families, their main goal is what we call fulfillment of family members. So, and our view is that's mainly about having a fulfilling job. And so this tends to lead to families where pretty much everybody works. There isn't that much difference in how men and women behave in these families. And so you have relatively similar gender roles in these kinds of families. By contrast, our view is that these traditional families, their view is that that there is something else that besides work that's very important, and so we call this purity, and protecting certain family members from this kind of nasty elements associated with work. and that this leads to a division of roles within the family naturally, and then we argue that these roles naturally become gendered. So our view is that it's these traditional families. So I'm now starting to get back to your question. It's these traditional families where you really see a problem of crisis of masculinity. So in these families, the story is such that the men are supposed to be breadwinners. And so when work disappears, that's a huge hit for them and their sense of self. They're not able to be the breadwinners they feel they're supposed to be, and so then they get to be very depressed. They're not seen within their community as doing what they're supposed to do, and there's a sense in which the women may also not want to marry them as much because they according to this value system they kind of look like they haven't done what they're supposed to do. And so this can cause a collapse in the marriage rate under this story when the work disappears. So these men become unmarriageable, and the women end up saying, oh, I'll just, I'll do the work myself. It's not the key thing to their identity. That may be more things like, say, taking care of the kids or something else. It's not quite as critical to their identity, but they can go out and work, and they get some identity from holding down the fort, looking after the kids, and doing what they need to do.
So have you done any studies or thought about different cultures? Like if you look at Korea, for example, I was there not too long ago talking about with their government about fertility. South Korea has the lowest fertility rate in the world, 0.73. And the question is, what's going on there? You need to produce 2.1 kids to reproduce yourself and your child if you're and your husband or male partner if you're female, and they're down to 0.73. So they're on a trajectory of going from like 56 million people down to about 12 million by the end of the century. So it's a huge crisis. And then
huge crisis.
And I was just struck in talking to this lady who was kind of shepherding me around to different meetings, and she was around 33, and she she wanted to be in the esteem group of, her mom was very keen on her getting married. She was not at all. And she said she had agreed to have one date, go on one blind date with her mom after she finished her accounting degree, which was going to be 2 years from now when she's like 35. And that was the deal she had struck with her mom. And why did she have to finish her accounting degree? Well, because the matchmaker company wouldn't take her unless she had a degree to match up with somebody else who had a degree. So it just strikes me that some of these, esteem groups are getting, this gets all institutionalized in the mating process, some level, or at least in certain cultures, or the connecting process. And I wonder whether let me make this the last question, since kind of we run out of our time here, but this could go on for hours. But do you think that these theories have testable implications where you can use different cultures as kind of testing grounds?
Yeah, so I think that's great. So I think, depending on the kind of story that you have, you react very differently to shocks as a family, or we could think about other situations as well. But I think, within a story, there are all kinds of very, there are very clear patterns about how people react to shocks. So that's something, for instance, with these traditional and modern families, I've thought a lot about. So there's a scholar who works on families, Catherine Eden, who's argued that there's sort of pretty much everybody has a kind of agreed view as to what an ideal order of action is, which is first something like you've got the career, then you do marriage, and then you have the kids. But there's some differences in what people consider to be acceptable in terms of order. So a lot of people who've become, there's been a big rise in single parenthood. So a lot of people have decided that, it's okay to have a kid before you have a career. You do the kid first, then you'll work on getting your career, and then you'll do marriage last. And maybe you'll date along the way, but you'll wait, and marriage is a very serious step, but you're going to have to wait until quite a late age to do that. So I think my sense of what's happened in Korea is that, and I think this is true of a lot of Asian countries, which have seen this huge decrease in fertility, is that they put huge value on making these investments in career. And their sense of order is such that, it's not acceptable really to break the order. So you got to get the career and then do marriage and then have kids. And, it takes a long time to get the career step before you can do either of the other two steps. And that's led to this huge decline in fertility. So possibly that will start to change over time, but it's very sticky.
So I have coming away from this, and unfortunately we're gonna have to bring this to a close, but I have a strong sense that you would have been much better placed to talk to these government officials in South Korea about how to change the situation with respect to fertility than me, because I was just focused on it in terms of, can we subsidize having children in that way? But I think you're speaking to a bigger issue, which is just, talking to everybody collectively, this national problem. Hey, the team effort here has got to be, we have kids, and we have to change some of our old ways of thinking. Maybe that conversation hasn't happened at the government level by the, by the president or whatever of South Korea. Anyway, this has been fascinating. Robby, we're going to get you back on down the pike.
Thank you, Larry. This is great.